While the world worshipped power and polished perfection, there was this one woman who worked in silence, unseen, unheard, and if you had passed her on the street, you would have sworn she was invisible. Her name was Grace Ellis, a black immigrant cleaner who spent her days polishing marble floors inside one of Connecticut's grandest estates. And I'm telling you right now, no one thought her presence mattered. Until the morning she blew a single soap bubble into the spring air, and a 5-year-old boy who hadn't smiled in 16 months lifted his head and did the impossible. He smiled. You see where I'm going? Yeah, that happened. And that little moment cracked open a story that none of the powerful people inside that mansion were ready to face. Grace was scrubbing the stone pathway behind the Whitmore estate that morning. Her knees pressed so hard against the ground, she barely noticed the ache. Her bucket half filled with soap and vinegar water, bubbles clinging to her skin in ways that stirred memories she hadn't visited in years. When she glanced up, the boy, Miles Whitmore, sat beneath the cherry tree like a question mark drawn in human form, back curled, eyes fixed on dirt. Therapists had come and gone, clipboards stacked with reports, none of them reaching him. He hadn't spoken a word since the night his mother collapsed at dinner. Staff were told not to look at him, not to touch him, leave it for the professionals. But Grace, she had lived enough silence of her own to know silence was still a language. So she dipped her fingers into the bucket, pinched a film of soapy water, lifted it to her lips, and exhaled. One bubble floated into the light. And for the first time in over a year, Miles's eyes followed something. And then he smiled, just barely, but enough to shatter a curse. What Grace didn't realize was that upstairs, Jonathan Whitmore, father, billionaire, master of order, was watching the security feed. He'd poured money into doctors, specialists, endless programs. None of it worked. And now this woman with a mop and cracked sneakers had done in 1 second what no expert could. He didn't know if he should feel grateful or humiliated. But he kept watching, day after day, as Miles appeared under that tree, waiting, and Grace, without asking permission, without saying a word, blew bubbles into the air. Each day he moved closer. One day he giggled. Another day he reached out a finger. And one morning, he pulled out a blue crayon and drew a circle on the stone. Then, looking straight at Grace, he patted the space inside it. No therapist had been invited there. No millionaire father. Just Grace. And she sat down. That was the first circle of trust. But here's the twist no one saw coming. Jonathan wasn't angry. He was terrified. His own son had reached for someone else. He summoned Grace into his office, pacing behind his desk like a man who had lost control of his own narrative. Why does he respond to you? He demanded. Grace, calm as always, said, maybe because I didn't ask him to. That line hit him harder than any accusation. She told him the truth. Miles wasn't a case study. He was a boy who had lost something no clipboard could measure. Jonathan didn't know what to do with that honesty, but it lodged in him. And for the first time, he stopped hiding behind cameras. He even knocked on his son's bedroom door one night. Just 2 knocks, nothing more. But it was a beginning, and then came the breakthrough. Grace and Miles were on the patio, bubble wand between them. She blew one high toward the glass ceiling. Miles's eyes followed, and suddenly, softly, he whispered, "Sky." The first word in 16 months. Grace steadied him with her calm. "It's okay." Jonathan heard it too, standing in the doorway, and dropped his coffee cup in shock. The bubble popped, the moment cracked, but Grace held Miles's hand, anchoring him. "It's okay," she whispered again, and Miles believed her. That single word, "Sky," meant more than all the therapy reports stacked in Jonathan's office. But power doesn't like disorder, and soon the whispers began. Board members questioned Jonathan's judgment. Legal advisors warned of negligence. The Hartfords, Miles's wealthy grandparents, filed for custody, dragging Grace into the courtroom as Exhibit A of his failures. Their lawyer thundered, "She's not a therapist, not family, not qualified." Jonathan's team countered with progress reports, testimonies, staff affidavits. But the case was slipping. And then the judge did something no one expected. She asked Miles, "Who makes you feel safe?" The room froze. He walked past his father, past the Hartfords, and stopped in front of Grace. Leaning into the mic, he whispered one word, "Bubbles." And in that single word, he destroyed every argument stacked against them. The judge signed the order. Custody stays with the father. The Hartfords sat stunned. The reporters scribbled furiously, but Grace only knelt beside Miles, holding his hand like nothing in the world had changed. After that, the estate transformed. Not instantly, but enough to matter. Grace wasn't just a cleaner anymore. She became Mama G. The name Miles blurted out one morning, a name that stuck. She didn't lead with authority. She led with presence. And soon Jonathan found himself bending too, arriving home earlier, shutting off the cameras, learning that love wasn't control but stillness. Together, they cleared the East Wing and opened a center called Simply the Place, where children like Miles could come without shame, without charts. No uniforms, no titles, just crayons, bubbles, and time. Miles thrived, guiding other kids the way Grace had guided him, showing them how silence wasn't absence, but safety. And then came the scene that sealed everything. One autumn afternoon, Miles walked into the garden with the old bubble wand. Jonathan followed, Grace close behind. Without a word, Miles dipped the wand, blew a single bubble into the air, and whispered, "That one's for Mom." The bubble drifted upward, catching the light, and the three of them stood hand in hand, watching until it disappeared. No headlines, no doctors, no cameras, just one boy honoring the woman he lost, surrounded by the family he found. And if you're asking me, that was the most cinematic ending anyone could have written. But here's the open question, the one I'll leave with you. Was it right for a cleaner with no certification to become the anchor of a billionaire's child? Was it justice, or just survival dressed up as grace? You tell me. Because sometimes the smallest acts, like blowing a bubble, carry the biggest debates about family, power, and what makes us safe to So I want to hear from you. What do you think? Was the judge right to trust a child's whisper over a courtroom full of experts? Was Jonathan right to fight against the Hartfords? Or was Grace the only one who ever really saw Miles for who he was? Drop your thoughts below, because stories like this don't end when the bubble pops. They live on in the choices we argue about, the ones that define us. The thing about bubbles, is that they never ask permission. They just rise, float, and disappear, and yet sometimes they leave behind more permanence than stone walls or court orders ever could. After the custody battle, the house felt different, lighter, like air had finally entered after years of being shut out. But I'd be lying if I said it was all peace after that, because peace never really settles clean, not when wealth, grief, and power are all tangled in the same living room. See, Jonathan had won in court, but in private, he was still learning how to show up, how to sit still with his son without trying to manage him like a quarterly report. And Grace, she wasn't a maid anymore. She wasn't even hired help. She had become something beyond labels, Mama G, the steady presence that Miles chose day after day. But power never forgets when it's been embarrassed, and the whispers didn't die down, they grew sharper. Some called it a miracle, others called it negligence dressed in sentiment, and the board of Whitmore Holdings wasn't happy about being tied to soap bubbles and silence. Jonathan had to fight on two fronts, protecting his son at home and protecting his empire in the world outside. And in that struggle, something unexpected started happening. He stopped hiding behind his titles and started leaning into the very thing he'd feared most, being human. But here's the twist that no one outside the mansion ever saw. Grace wasn't just saving Miles, she was saving Jonathan too. The man who had once sat behind tinted glass, watching his son through security feeds, now found himself kneeling on the patio floor, clumsy fingers trying to form bubbles that popped too soon, and laughing through tears when Miles giggled anyway. That sound, that little laugh, was enough to cut through every ounce of armor he'd ever worn. And in those moments, Jonathan wasn't a billionaire CEO or a widower under scrutiny. He was just a dad trying, failing, and trying again. Weeks rolled into months, and the estate's East Wing turned into something no one had planned for, a refuge for children who'd been written off, silenced, or shamed by a world that only respected credentials and outcomes. They called it the place, and if you'd walked in, you wouldn't have seen therapists with charts or executives with agendas. You'd have seen crayons scattered on rugs, soap buckets in corners, kids humming songs that had no words, and Grace, steady in the center of it all, not leading, not performing, just present. Miles thrived there, guiding other kids in bubble games, showing them how to draw circles, how to be quiet without feeling alone. And every time he whispered a new word, the walls of that house echoed with something it hadn't heard in years: life. And yet, beneath the joy, there was always this question, unspoken but heavy. Could something built on such fragile beginnings really last? The Hartfords hadn't disappeared, the world still questioned, and Jonathan still carried shame like a second skin. But then came the moment that silenced all doubt. One crisp fall afternoon, Miles walked into the garden holding that old wand, chipped and faded. Grace followed him, Jonathan a step behind. No one spoke. The boy dipped the wand, lifted it high, and blew a single bubble that floated into the golden light. He whispered, soft but steady, "That one's for Mom." No one moved, no one breathed too loudly. Grace reached for Jonathan's hand, and for once he didn't resist. He took it, holding on not like a man grasping control, but like someone finally letting go. And in that silence, a child carried his grief into the sky with nothing but soap and air, and somehow it was enough. Enough to heal, enough to connect, enough to remind them all that family isn't about roles or contracts. It's about who stays when everything else falls apart. Let me leave you with this. What do you believe made the difference here? Was it Grace, the woman nobody expected? Was it Jonathan finally dropping his armor? Or was it Miles, a 5-year-old boy, teaching all the adults that healing doesn't come from reports, but from presence, from bubbles, from silence held together by love? You tell me. Because maybe the real question isn't who saved who, but whether we're brave enough to recognize salvation when it comes from the most unexpected place.